just some basics of rights issues when it comes to oral histories, and also a couple of useful resources before I pass it on to our colleagues who can give some more concrete examples and reflection coming from their perspectives. So, um, I will say most of my experience working with oral history and copyright actually comes out of a project that I worked on with my colleague Janessa Mahar, who's our anthropology librarian, and I think I saw come into the room as a participant here. Janessa was the PI on a project that um, we worked on having to do with really going back to collections of indigenous oral histories collected in North America from a number of groups, and thinking about ways that we could connect with those tribal governments, with archives and museums, and have conversations about often older materials where we didn't necessarily have permissions documentation or other kinds of things. And so those were some of the most complicated cases. So you'll see when I go through this content that some of it could apply to materials that you're creating today, right now, but some of it also might apply to materials that were created 50 or even 60 years ago, and thinking about how to navigate sometimes really sticky situations where you want to share and you want to make sure that these materials aren't lost to the source communities, but also to be sensitive about how personal some of the stories might be. So when I think about key concepts kind of cutting across the board, I think about access, legal issues, and ethical issues all coming together. And I had another document where this was all sort of triangulated, and I don't know how to make diagrams in WordPress, but all of these really connect with one another. And so hopefully you'll see that thread throughout this. So legal issues and impacts. A couple of highlights here. I won't read all of this out. I will, however, put the link to this into the chat if anyone wants to actually go into this now or later on. Um, so first thinking about the scope of copyright and where it applies. Oral history, like other kinds of oral tradition, has always had a complicated place in the realm of copyright because copyright, especially in countries where it's coming out of kind of publishing traditions, has focused almost entirely on the idea of having an original author and having things be tangible and concrete and written down, essentially. So whatever we might be talking about, it is not the person's voice speaking that is protected by copyright. It is the recording or the tangible, concrete takeaway from that interview that is protected. And I say recording, it might also be a transcript or other kinds of things that are what we call fixed. And that can be really difficult. So even my voice now, as I'm talking to you, it's the recording that will be protected by copyright, not just my sort of off the cuff remarks. Some countries have amended their copyright laws to try to protect what are known as traditional cultural expressions. And so you'll see that term if you look deeply into kind of the literature of intellectual property or copyright. Most have not, but there are some exceptions. I know Haiti, for instance, has some language about this in copyright law. And there's been a trend, I think, over the last few decades of being more aware of the possibilities of how we might protect things like folk songs, dances, prayers. Some of these do come up in oral histories, but in general, these are kind of unprotected. And so it's left to us, mostly from an ethical side of things, to decide how and when to share some materials that might be culturally sensitive. Um, Then thinking about the legal ownership, I will talk about, and my colleagues will talk about different ways of working with interviewees and establishing some of the rights in this. I just want to stress up front, please make sure that you're talking about permissions ahead of time, that you're getting these down in writing and finding ways of keeping them. Attach them to the interview transcripts. Do anything you can. Submit them to the repositories. I cannot stress enough, and I think Janessa might be laughing if she's here because we went through our oral history center's archives on campus to find permissions, and we found everything. We found forms, we found logs, we found all kinds of things, but it was like a puzzle trying to put it back together. And that's no one's fault. It's not really a criticism. It's just that over time, the chain of custody of our archives is often so important, but sometimes the documentation underlying that gets kind of lost in the ether. So there might be a lot of different copyrights within a single oral history. Obviously, we're very interested in the interviewees' rights in their own story and in the interview itself. But also, there might be students or staff doing interviews. That people might be editing transcripts. There might be an interviewer who's actually on, recorded as well. This gets really sticky. I have further down here, I have a link to an article that if you want to kind of go into the weeds, you can see some of the legal discussion of this. But I think in general, assuming that at the very least, the person doing the interviewing and the person being interviewed have some rights in this is helpful. And especially when it comes to getting permissions, trying to cover your bases, and kind of being aware of getting sign off from anyone who was involved. That never hurts. Um, so I'm going to skip over some of this and just go to I've been working on kind of a decision and workflows outline and thinking about what are some of the questions that you need to be asking. Again, some of this might apply to older interviews, but it's certainly relevant to newer interviews as well. Because of when oral history really started as a field, we can assume that most of these recordings are going to be protected by copyright, whether we're talking about the recording itself or the transcript. There might be some exceptions for very early interviews from the 60s or 70s, but often those are the exception and not the rule. So certainly, again, do you have those signed forms from interview participants, or are you getting those as part of a living, active oral history project? If not, is it feasible to go back and obtain signed forms? Obviously, if you did the interviews a couple years ago, that would be easier than if you did them 60 years ago. But we certainly have worked with communities who have gone back to family members and really worked within their networks to find those permissions. Um, where you don't have signed permission and it's really not feasible, can you rely on some kind of exception in copyright law? I won't go into the weeds. I've already had a whole session on evaluating copyright status, and have shared some information about things like exceptions. But that is a big conversation too, to balancing the risk of infringing copyright with the value of some of these materials to our communities and our missions. And then again, are there any ethical or cultural sensitivities that might require different levels of access, sharing online versus on site, where these should be shared in terms of, say, at a university archive versus a community archive? And then finally, thinking about the terms of use, how are you communicating through your rights statement or another format, ways that people can use these materials downstream? So, do you have a clear statement about whether this is protected? How might someone reuse the interview? And is there any other kind of additional information? Not necessarily you must do this or you must not do this, but rather, can you give some context about how things may or may not be used in ways that conform to the wishes of the collecting institution, the community, or a particular member of the family, even.